Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Hanover Nonsense, the show where I, a single student, go out to various events and then the day after give my opinion on them. So, last night's event on the 1st of April, not a joke, was a cultural competency event, the subject matter of which was that of different faiths. The word that they used was interfaith relations. Well, that's two words, I suppose. But that was the subject matter of the night. And there at the beginning of the event, everybody who was in attendance was given a handout, which, if I did my editing job, should be on the screen right now and will remain so for most of the video. And we'll get to that when it becomes relevant. In the meantime, I'll continue talking as you look it over. On the back of this sheet, I took several notes, and that's what I'll be referring to for the rest of this video. Now, before I really begin, I would like to begin by saying I was very surprised by how speed limit I was surprised that it wasn't radical like I had expected it to be. It was rather, well, standard for leftists, which is still undesirable, but it shows that we haven't gotten to the point of no return. And when I say we, I mean Hanover College. And when I say point of no return, I mean, well, see what happened to Evergreen. That is the point of no return. But anyway, so to begin, the event was opened up with a trivia style asking of, I think, 10 to 12 questions. Fairly, how should I say, non-provocative. It was just historical questions based around faith, which I thought that was very nice. I did enjoy that, even though I knew very little. I found it quite enjoyable. But then we got into the actual talking, where we were spoken to, and the opener for this, aside from the trivia, was that many different groups are working towards the same thing, with the implication, at least in my mind, there being that since there are numerous groups working towards the same thing, why isn't cooperation easier? And again, this is most likely just my own mind working a little bit too hard here, but I'll still address this point. The reason why cooperation is so difficult is because of, at least what I think, is because of methodology, and history. While the past is consigned to the past, there are those that still hold grudges. To give an example of how ridiculous this can be, I would suggest you look into recent developments regarding the Spanish asking the Vatican for an apology, and then later Muslims asking the Spanish for an apology. Or, no, sorry, the Central Americans asking for an apology, I suppose, as opposed to the Spanish. Anyway, continuing on from there, an importance of context, that point was made. And my only thought was that bringing that up was ironic, as context seems to mean everything when the person being looked at and criticized is on your side. However, when it is someone who is not, it seems that context doesn't matter. See Count Dankula for a relatively famous example, I think. So, next, a common point was brought up of the equity versus equality argument, which I, upon a very quick Google search, equity being defined as the quality of being fair and impartial, with equality being defined as the state of being equal, especially in status, rights, and opportunities. These are similar, and they are not the same thing. However, I think the way that the word equity is used by these types of people, it is used incorrectly. Fairness and impartiality should come, I should say, with equality, for the part of equality where you are equal in rights, opportunities, status. Now, the rights is the key word there, as for to link to equity, which I think the word equity, when used by these kinds of people, is seeing to the needs of other people, which is all well and good. It's a very nice thing to do. However, it's not tenable. Most likely, it's not tenable, especially given that some people need more than others. Now, I'm not saying we cut off what we do have. Those are still the things that we do have are still very helpful. But I'm saying that achieving equality, in the achievement of equality, which we have under law at the very least, equity will come eventually. The next point that was made, coming off of the equality versus equity argument, is an activity that was done where several identical stations were set up with a sheet of paper with 11 questions on it and several strips of red paper. Now, the purpose of this activity was for each person to go up to one of these 3 stations. They were all identical, so it didn't matter, and to read the questions on the sheet of paper. And if you could answer yes to the question, you were to take a slip of paper. And if you answered no, you were to not. And the idea will lead to an argument made a little bit later. But I noticed in the crowd that several people had several sheets of paper, and I think this was because the majority of people who attended the event were of Christian or atheist faith. Now, myself being the only omnitheist there, I felt kind of alone, but that's normal. Now we can start to talk about the compass sheet that I have left up. So, according to the key legend, at the bottom, the north direction represents equity, which is defined as justice for all. Although I think what these people mean by justice is an equal outcome. To the I need to learn my cardinal directions. West is learning, which is the subtitle given below that is fairly standard, to take in new ideas and knowledge and whatnot. To the east is unlearning, which the way it was described during the event was that there are some ideas and practices and whatnot that need to be let go. And that was the most milquetoast way of putting it. And it was also the most agreeable, way of putting it, I think. And lastly, at the south, there is oppression, represented by a skull, which that's not a subliminal message at all. The needle represents how the direction in which one's actions and beliefs and attitudes are leading them towards. And though you can't see all of it, the rope that is up at the top of the compass represents the community that you are within. Now, this is partially, It is partially related to an argument made right before we flip this over, that relating to the 11 questions, where certain what am I thinking about? Certain places, and by my estimation, they were talking about the United States, do not acknowledge and do not have programming. They do not acknowledge certain religious holidays and do not have certain programming for certain religions. Now, during this presentation, when this part of the argument was brought up, total disregard was had for regional differences. As I imagine, in the United States, it is easy to imagine that in the United States there are very few, if any, Jewish or Muslim TV programs to be had during their high holidays. However, I also imagine that in the Middle East there is an abundance of Muslim programming and acknowledgement of holidays and whatnot, while Christian programming and whatnot is scarce. The argument made during the cultural competency event did not acknowledge regional differences, which leads into the very next argument, which is where I believe the event started to go downhill. Because of the lack of religious programming and acknowledgement of holidays that aren't Christian in America, the prospect of religious privilege was brought up. Now, I do not think that in this instance the word privilege and the power that comes with it, apparently, is referencing the majority. The majority of people in the United States, well, maybe not anymore, but at least earlier in the country's history, the majority of people in the United States were Christian. As a result, the majority would look after its own interests, quite obviously. And the argument brought up was that people with privilege need to use it for good. Now, good was not defined, quite unsurprisingly, but essentially it was being advocated that people in a majority should look out not for their own interests, but instead for the interests of the minority. Now, in a voting system, that doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, it's a voting system. And yes, or any dominant religion, I suppose. I sense, though, that no complaints would be made about the Middle East, where Islam is the majority, and thus would have the most of this quote-unquote privilege. And the way it was phrased, that people need to use their quote-unquote privilege for quote-unquote good, was rather... what's the term that would convey? Was rather disheartening, I suppose, because it meant that if you are a member of the majority and you supposedly have this privilege, you should not look out for your interests. You should instead look out for the interests of others, you should look out for the interests of others who are not in your group. And that is an unsettling argument to make, I think, because when you look out only for the interests of others, one runs the risk of being manipulated by those others. Now, I don't want to suggest that every person who's not a member of a majority group has some agenda that needs to be fulfilled. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that some people do, and they would jump at the chance for some useful idiot to come along to step aside and let them take control. Such a thing would be bad, I think. And the reasons why people with privilege don't act were presented as three were presented. Number one was that using your privilege for quote unquote good is uncomfortable. 2, using your privilege for quote unquote good is not the path of least resistance, and thus standing by, and doing nothing is the path of least resistance. And number 3, it was presented that people with this privilege think, well, no one else is doing anything, so why should I? Which led to the statement that everyone deserves to be able to tell their story, which I find that phrasing somewhat distasteful, and I can't fully explain why. But my immediate thought when that was said was that not everybody wants to, and also that not everybody needs to. And I understand I will be disagreed with on that second part, but I don't think it is realistic to believe that everyone wants to come out and talk about themselves. Perhaps they do. Perhaps I am really out of touch with humanity. But the tell their story, the tell their story statement I found to be somewhat unsettling. And by this point, we were approaching the end of the event. It was only an hour and a half long, if my clock was correct. And it was ended off by saying that even though this particular facet is very easy to observe, it is the bigger picture is not because of layers of privilege. And then that's when it happened. The magic I word came up. The title that describes the religion of the alt-left. Intersectionality. That is when it came up that these issues, and you can't see me, but I did do air quotes there, issues are complex when stacked against each other because of layers of privilege. And then the speaker attempted to induce white guilt by addressing that that straight white males who are sure of themselves are at the top of this stack. Or I suppose they have several layers of privilege, if we're going to go with the layers metaphor that was used, which, from a standpoint of someone who has observed these kinds of things, the description of what was given was of the straight white male being on top is exactly the opposite of the alt-left stack that puts them at the bottom. I think, quite obviously, there's a parallel there. And after the speaker attempted to induce white guilt, the event was wrapped up. And before I stop wasting your time for the day, I would like to very quickly talk about the snacks that were presented as a kind of lighthearted and less serious approach to the event. So the snacks that were presented were cinnamon rolls, and I didn't get at the cinnamon rolls early. I picked up a few after the event was over, and I want to say that they weren't bad, but they weren't great. They were mediocre cinnamon rolls. And honestly, I believe they probably would have been pretty good had they been warm, but they were kind of cold, and there was a little bit too much frosting. But I mean, if if these events conti- continue to provide semi-decent snacks, then, well, I suppose I will have an additional incentive to keep going besides these videos. But yes, as for what I think of the event as a whole, jumping back, I suppose, the event was rather moderate compared to some of the more radical things happening out in the world. However, I do believe that it is still not a good place to be, as at the end an ideology was being peddled. Not in the beginning with the trivia and the informative things. That was informative and impartial, as well as certain other points within. However, at the end, an ideology was peddled. And to contrast to the first episode of Hanover Nonsense, the crowd's reaction was tame, and I do think that this is because what was being said during the cultural competency event was what the crowd wanted to hear, as opposed to in Senate with the Mike Pence scholarship, how that was not what the crowd wanted to hear. As a result, this crowd was far more receptive, and I think that obviously shows a bias and a lack of acceptance, despite certain virtue signalers saying that they are accepting. But as for the event, it was relatively speed limit. However, it was peddling an ideology, and that is, I find the fact that it was relatively speed limit to be somewhat of a relief. However, that does not mean that it is okay. This is a college campus. Ideology should not be pushed upon students. Ideology should be studied, of course, but it should not be pushed upon students. And that is my opinion of the event. That it was not what I was expecting, which in this instance is good, but it was still not an alright thing in my mind. Had it just been an information session, that would have been wonderful and perfectly acceptable in my mind. But once we got to the last, I'd like to say 10 or 20 minutes, that's when it went from acceptable to not so. But anyway, I've been your host, GZ, and this has been episode 2 of Hanover Nonsense. Hopefully in the future I will have something better to deliver, some good news, I think. Anyway, I will see you next time. Goodbye.